I'm with Food and Drink Industry Ireland, which is the representative body within IBEC for food manufacturers and suppliers. Earlier this week, we published a report on Brexit and the challenges that are going to be faced by the food and drink sector here in Ireland. Is this thing working? Yep, got it. Press the right button. It's just the right. Thanks. Why is Brexit so important to food and drink? The reason it's important is that we're by far the most exposed sector. The UK is our largest trading partner, and that's east-west and north-south. We're also the largest export market for UK food and drink, and we're their second supplier. Netherlands is ahead of us, but we're their second supplier. 41% of our food and drink products go to the UK, which is 4.4 billion. And if you look at the breakdown in individual sectors, pretty much every major sector in the food and drink industry is affected. Prepared consumer foods are the most exposed. 70% of products go to the UK. Meat, it's 56%. Dairy is 30%, but within dairy, 60% of cheese exports go to the UK. And for alcoholic beverages, it's 32%. Back in July, after the Brexit vote, IBEC carried out a survey of its members, about 450 respondents in total. And when we stripped out the food and drink responses, what we found was that even though food and drink companies were better prepared, typically about 50-51% were either hedged or had pricing arrangements in place with their UK customers, compared with about 26% for business as a whole. When they looked at the impact and the threat to their sales, to their value of their exports and the general impact on their businesses, they were much more worried than the overall business response across the country. So I think this very, very much reflects the exposure that the sector feels and the challenges that it faces, and those challenges I think will spread into the wider economy, because food and drink is so deeply interlinked and intertwined with all regions of the country. So for us, it's different this time. There's obviously a lot of talk in terms of the forthcoming UK-EU negotiations around the actual exit process, and on Friday in Bratislava the Council will be meeting, and we've Juncker at the moment is actually doing his State of the Union address, so we'll be starting to see the very early indications of the EU negotiating position, and we're starting to see some early indications come out of the UK as well. That's going to be hugely important, and I'll talk about that in due course in terms of the trading relationship that we're going to face in time. But right here and right now we face a much more substantial challenge, and that challenge is the currency. And the currency is important because if we don't get this thing sorted, we're not going to have the same level of market share that we currently have. So we'll be actually negotiating for a slice of the pie, to put it bluntly, that's going to be less than we currently have. So the key priority for government from a food industry perspective is to try and retain the slice of the pie. So why is it different this time? We're currently at about sort of 84, 85 pence. We've been there on a number of occasions before. It's different this time because the conditions, the economic and the business conditions, not just here but particularly in the UK, are different. And in the report we've outlined 8 specific areas why this is the case, and we've compared 2010 with 2016. The first of those is that the Brexit by its very nature is actually causing a structural change in the currency and the currency valuation. We've had plenty of cyclical changes before. 2009, very, very painful for the industry and for the wider economy, but that was cyclical. This one is not. Our view is that it's structural, and if anything, the downside in terms of where the value is going to be is a hell of a lot higher than the upside. The other point worth bearing in mind then, compared with 2010, is that there's limited capacity within the industry here to drive further efficiencies. There's a huge amount of work done 2009, 2010, 2011 at company level to drive efficiencies, to remove costs. There was a lot of support from the agencies such as Enterprise Ireland's Lean programme and so on. So an awful lot of that has already been done, leaving limited scope for further efficiencies to be driven within businesses. And total volumes and values are higher. If you look at sort of the breakdown of food exports, there's been a strategy here to try and diversify away from the UK market. John was talking earlier on about the trade mission and the minister opening up the new Board B office in Singapore. And certainly we've seen substantial growth in exports to continental Europe and also to third countries, our international markets. But when you look at the ratio between UK, other EU countries and international markets, the percentages have roughly stayed the same. UK exports are at 41%. They've dropped from probably about 43, 44% over the last few years. What has actually happened is that we've substantially grown business in the UK as well. Effectively, we've added on about €1 billion worth of exports to that market. So that's an extra billion which is now at risk if we don't get this thing sorted out. And also there's the pricing strategy of UK retailers. So we need to bear in mind is we're in a completely different environment now than we were back in 2009. In 2009, UK food inflation was running at 5%. Sorry, 2010 it was running at 5%. Food inflation in the UK currently is negative. It's about -2, -3%. General inflation is running at about 0.5. It's driven by core things like energy and so on, but food inflation is significantly negative. So that's the environment that companies are facing when they're going along trying to get a degree of cost recovery for currency changes. It's not going to happen, and that's the feedback not just from Irish companies, but from UK companies who are importing ingredients, that there's a total inability to get any price pass-through. So a very, very difficult environment faced by companies at the moment. There's going to be a potential for a significant impact on supply chains. Sort of one way of putting it is Ireland, for many food categories, we're the preferred supplier at the moment. Preferred supplier means we can provide high quality, sustainable, cost competitive product with security of supply. But the sort of changes that we're seeing taking place are creating a huge amount of uncertainty in those supply chains, and we do face the risk of the major buyers looking for alternatives and looking for the development of free trade agreements and sourcing large volumes of cheaper product from third country markets, from South America, from down in New Zealand, Australia, and so on. So that's a risk that we face. So it's absolutely critical that we maintain confidence in Ireland as a preferred supplier. There's also market renationalisation taking place. We have a number of UK retailers who source exclusively British meat products. So that straight away limits the market that's available for Irish meat. And across the European Union, we're seeing growing market renationalisation. The French have managed to strong-arm the Commission into getting country of origin labelling, a pilot put in place effectively on a mandatory level for dairy products for a year. And as a result of that, we're starting to see similar initiatives pop up in countries like Italy, Portugal, Romania, and so on. So these things are happening, and that market renationalisation is not what an export-oriented country like Ireland actually wants. We also have a much more competitive UK retail market and food service market than was the case in the past. Back in 2010, the four major retailers over there pretty much ran the market. But since then, we've seen the hard discounters, Aldi and Lidl, increase market share from 5% to 10%. So they've doubled their market share in a small number of years, and they're only going in one direction. And there's a natural reaction from the larger retailers to that, and that feeds through in terms of the response of those retailers to a currency shift like this. And finally, not just from an export perspective, but we need to think about the domestic market as well, because the domestic market still remains, in value terms, the largest market for Irish food production, and probably the only market for many small and medium-sized food companies. And if we look back at 2009 to 2013, what we saw over those years for the prepared consumer food sector was a year-on-year growth, significant growth in the amount of prepared consumer foods imports into Ireland at a time when the overall grocery retail market was declining because of the wider economic conditions that we faced. And we now are in the crazy situation as a food nation that prepared consumer foods, Irish produced prepared consumer foods, have a 40% market share, in other words a minority market share of the domestic market. So the bottom line really is that the environment now is very different this time than it was in 2010, and there's a significant and deep inability for food producers in this country to pass through the impact of the currency shift that's already occurred, with all indications that if anything it's likely to get worse. So in our report, our economic unit within IBEC carried out a comprehensive economic analysis of the situation as it stands at the moment. The qualifier here obviously is that there's a significant amount of uncertainties out there, so their analysis to a certain extent was historical in nature, but obviously they tried to be forward-looking and come up with some guesstimates of what could happen. A couple of points worth bearing in mind. Sorry, I'm just missing 2 slides here, so I'll just actually run through them verbally. But one of the things we found was that the whole issue of margins is very different now than it was the case in the past. With the additional exports that we managed to achieve, we did that at a certain cost to an extent, in the sense that it was as a result of lower unit prices, effectively lower margins. And when we look at the industrial output figures, what we find is that over the period 2010 to 2015, volumes rose by 46%. But value rose by 27%, or turnover rose by 27%. So effectively, lower unit prices, lower margins. So that's a situation that we find ourselves in, and that's a growth that could actually be impacted. When we actually take a look at the exchange rates and their impact on demand, what we found was in 2009, the exchange rate climbed by 15%, very similar to the situation that we find ourselves in now at the moment. And in the following number of months, monthly Irish agricultural exports fell by 25%. But at the same time, UK food retail sales only fell by 2.5%. In other words, we lost a significant amount of market share very, very quickly as a result of that sterling impact. The other thing we've noticed, I suppose, is the rapid nature of the shift in currency, what our economists refer to as the shock effect. And we've really only seen 2 other similar incidences since over the last, say, 25 years or thereabouts. It was 2009, and then there was 1993, back in the time of Black Monday. And the analysis shows that both 1993 and 2009 were a signal of a significant downturn in the Irish food sector. So all the warning signs are there. Plug all that information in and get the economists to engage in a little bit of dismal science, and this is what they come out with in terms of their estimates. In short, what they find is that every time you get a drop in currency, you're going to get an impact on the exports. And what you're looking at, if we head towards 90 pence, and bear in mind, 2015, you'd have been looking at an average of about 73 pence. So that's what companies were working off, in 2015, 73 pence. In August, the average in August was 85.4 pence. But if you were looking at a year-long average of 90 pence, you'd be looking at a 16% drop in exports, which is about 700 million. And our estimates would impact from a jobs point of view at 7,500 job losses. So this is very, very significant. If the currency moved to £1, so parity, our estimate is you'd be looking at, on an annual basis, a 17% reduction in exports. So 17% reduction year on year. And of course, the point to bear in mind is the way the agri-food sector operates here, it's got deep linkages back to the wider economy. So over half of all spend on goods, services and labour, in other words payroll, by the total Irish manufacturing sector occurs in the food manufacturing and production. And 90% of agricultural output is actually used by the food manufacturing sector here. So if the food sector starts to sneeze, the overall economy is going to get a cold. In terms of business cost comparisons, the National Competitiveness Council in their most recent report on the cost of doing business in Ireland had the following to state: Ireland remains an expensive location in which to do business, with a price profile that can best be described as high cost, rising slowly. So we're starting from a point of disadvantage already. And when you start to look in and drill down into some of the specifics, if you take labour, for example, labour costs very, very important because they can constitute for manufacturing 49 to 72% of business costs. And the thing to bear in mind is when you look at, say, a lot of the raw materials, the commodities, many of those are priced on a international basis, some on a global basis, some on a regional basis. So to a certain extent, if you're trying to compare your competitive position, to a certain extent you can discount those because it's the differentiators that are going to cause you problems. And they're things like labour costs, energy costs, insurance costs and so on. But we're starting from a point of view where we're already significantly costlier from a labour point of view than our competitors in the UK. And as the sterling moves, they become even more cost competitive in terms of their labour inputs. Similarly, from an employer liability point of view, which would be one of the more significant insurance costs faced by the Irish food manufacturing sector, 1.6% of payroll is what companies are typically paying for their insurance costs at the moment, and facing increased rises, 7% in 2015, according to a survey that IBEC carried out of its members earlier on this year. And again, another problem with our slides. The other one I just wanted to mention was the whole issue of capital costs, access to finance, and the cost of money. And when you look at the numbers, again, be it the National Competitiveness Council, the Central Bank, or even our own analysis that we carried out of the access to finance needs as a prepared consumer food sector in 2015, there's a substantial difference across loans below 1 million, which are a good marker for SMEs, and loans above 1 million, which are a good marker for loans to larger businesses, between the margins that are experienced in Ireland and across the Eurozone. And 2 points worth bearing in mind: earlier on this week, there was reports out which showed that the percentage of non-performing loans in Irish banks were at the higher end in Europe, which is certainly the case. But if you look at the cost of money in Ireland versus the other peripheral countries such as Portugal and Spain and so on, what you've seen over the last year or two as the ECB is pumping large sums of money into the Eurozone economies is that their cost of finance has dropped significantly. That hasn't happened here in Ireland. Similarly, if you do an analysis and strip out all the local conditions in Ireland, that would be a high percentage of non-performing loans, you still find that the price premium is significantly higher in Ireland. Ireland versus UK, it's 1%. In other words, Irish money is at a very minimum 1% more expensive than it is in the UK. So it's another cost disadvantage that's faced here in the country. To look very briefly then at, say, some of the market and business implications. I've talked already about the UK. There's been a fundamental shift in the environment there. So the big issue for us is that there will be a loss of confidence in us as being sort of a cost competitive, secure and stable supply base. There's been a huge amount of work done to build up the markets that we have. Those could easily be lost, if not overnight, over a very, very short period of time, unless proper measures are taken. Domestically, as I mentioned, we face the problem of displacement by imports in our largest single market. And then in other export markets, UK exports are going to be more competitive against us. They suddenly have a 15% price advantage straight off. But the other issue for Irish companies is that as our overall volumes decline, capacity utilization and efficiency drops in Irish manufacturing plants. And again, that reduces our competitive position in overseas markets. And obviously, there's a whole north-south dimension as well, and the risk of cross-border shopping raising its head again with reduced volumes south of the border. Over the longer term, a new trading relationship is going to be formed between the EU and the UK. And obviously that means between Ireland and the UK, north-south, east-west. The thing to bear in mind is that we have a deeply entwined business and trade relationship. It's not just in finished goods, it's intra-company. So within companies, there's a huge amount of material traveling from site to site for final finishing. And then there's a huge amount of ingredients flowing business to business as opposed to business to consumer between companies as well. So it's very, very complex, and it's going to be very, very difficult to unravel the supply chains, cost-effective supply chains that are already in place. So there are a number of issues which I think are going to need to be addressed over time, and Ireland needs to have a significant place at the table on that, because we are by far the most impacted country, and food and drink is by far the most affected sector as regards that as well. So we need to make sure that the single market, insofar as it can be maintained between the UK and Europe, or effectively between UK and Ireland. We need to avoid tariffs, customs barriers being put up. We're going to have a huge range of complex issues in relation to sourcing, ingredients, labelling, even something as simple as All Ireland geographical indications. So Irish whiskey, which is protected under EU legislation, is an all-island geographical indication. So Bushmills is probably the biggest brand north of the border as regards that. What's going to happen in a situation where you'll have part of that being within the EU and potentially part of that outside the EU? These are all the unintended consequences that are going to have to be addressed, and creating a legal nightmare and a legal headache. And over the longer term, there's a great need as well to minimise food regulatory divergence, which can cause huge problems for countries. So the whole issue of equivalence in terms of regulation is going to be very important, because that flows through into how companies operate their business, their manufacturing systems and so on as well. So our call to action is that we need an immediate Brexit response process. This is unprecedented. This is a challenge like we've never faced before. And we have a whole series of recommendations which are contained in our report. They need to start off with taking a look again at Foodwise 2025. That's the enterprise-led national agri-food strategy. Everything that we do in food as regards policy is looked through the prism now of Foodwise 2025. We've had a game changer in terms of the Brexit vote. So it's very incumbent on us, as it would be, I think, with every individual company strategy, to go back and take a look and see, is it now fit for purpose, or does it need to be amended? This needs to be led in terms of the overall response by the Department of the Taoiseach. Most of the action obviously is going to take place from our perspective in the Department of Agriculture and Food, but a lot of the issues which are required here are are cross-government. So this needs to be led from the very highest level. And then there's a whole series of supports that industry are going to need in terms of enterprise stabilisation and employment support. And a huge amount of money is going to need to be put into protecting those markets. And that means flowing in through Enterprise Ireland and particularly Bord Bia in terms of market promotion in the UK, continental markets and further afield, but also for individual companies who are going to need a lot of support to be able to invest in getting more boots on the ground to maintain those markets and to develop new markets. That's a very, very expensive business, and they're going to need a lot of support to do that, and to do that now. The financing I've talked about, we've been moving very, very slowly in terms of getting an agri-food fund in place. It's absolutely essential that finance flows quickly and immediately into the sector, and it's long-term finance at competitive rates. And the whole issue of cost competitiveness needs to be looked at again. As we said earlier on, we're a high-cost country. Fair enough, we're efficient and so on. but we've now lost another 15% of cost competitiveness versus our nearest neighbour. And finally, the budget is coming up in a few weeks, and we need to make sure that the measures that are in there are not going to cause any damage to the industry, and the sort of tax recommendations that are contained both in FDII's budget submission and the overall IBEC budget submission are put in place there, particularly around things like support for entrepreneurs. So that's it for me. That's the actual report itself. It's available on our website. You'll see our details there. If anybody is looking for a hard copy of the report, just email me there on my contact details, and I'd be happy to post a copy out to you. Thanks very much.